And then our cosine, actually, it starts up and then works our way down and around. Okay, so again, the period is 2 pi from 0 to 2 pi is that interval. Okay, and then it just keeps on going. Okay, now we don't have to graph everything. Okay, so they'll give us our interval from that, and then we can stop right. If it's 0 to 2 pi, we can just show from here to here or from here to here. Okay. Now, if you notice the difference between these, okay, with the sine and cosine, is our intersection, right? Our intercepts of the x-axis, the y-axis. If you notice with sine, our intercepts are 0, pi, 2 pi, whereas for cosine is pi and a half and 3 pi over 2. So like the 90 degrees and the 270 degrees, okay? To graph these, our 5 key points we need to find are our intercepts, and then our maximum and our minimum points. Okay. Now, if we say, let's sketch our graph from 2 of y equals 2 times sine of x on an interval of negative pi to 4 pi. So we're going to go from, for here, negative pi, and then we're going to keep going all the way to 4 pi over here. Okay, so we're going to have multiple periods with it in this. Okay, now from that, if you notice our original sine and cosine curve, our max value normally is +1 and our minimum is -1. Same thing with our cosine curve. Max is 1, minimum is -1. Okay. When we put a number in the front, think of this. If I know the sine of 0 is 0, when I go, or is 1, when I multiply that, okay, we get to 2, right? So this 2 actually makes our max to be 2 instead of 1, and our min then to be what? Just -2, okay? So from this, our sine, okay? So once again, our sine is going to be, so if I look at y equals 2 sine of x, okay. We know our intercept is still going to be at, our first intercept is still going to be at 0, 0, right? We're not shifting our graph left, right, up, down. We're going to be at 0, 0 from here, okay? Now, our next point, okay, so if you look at your basic sine curve, our next point is usually pi over 2, comma 1, right? Okay, for our max now, we're still going to be at pi over 2, but instead of our max of being 1, our max is going to be what? 2, right? Because the sine of pi over 2 is 1, and then 1 times 2 would be 2, right? Okay. Now, our next intercept, we know as we keep coming around, is going to be at 0, comma, or excuse me, pi, comma, 0. Then at 3 pi over 2, we're going to have our minimum of -2, because our sine of 3 pi over 2 is -1. And what's -1 times 2? -2. And then once again, we're going to have an intercept of 2 pi, comma, 0. Okay. So the only thing that changes, if we're looking at just our interval from 0 to 2 pi, when we have 2 in the front, the only difference that changes is our max is 2 and our minimum is -2. Okay, so I'm going to graph that part for us to start out, and then we'll finish up. Okay. So 1, 2, -1, -2. And then we break it up into 90 degrees. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. And then we're going to keep going in a second. But if we just do our interval from 0 to 2 pi, our graph would look like this. So our intercept is at 0, 0. At pi over 2, we have a max of 2. At pi is 0. 3 pi over 2 goes down to our minimum. 2 pi is our intercept. So this is what our graph would look like, up from 0 to 2 pi. But is that where we want our interval to be? No, we want it from negative pi to 4 pi. So I'm going to go ahead and do the negative pi first. Okay, so if I go backwards, so negative pi over 2, and then negative pi. So if we know pi over 2 is a maximum of positive 2, what do you think negative pi over 2 would be? Keeping our curve. Where do you think that coordinate would be? So if I look at negative pi over 2, where do you think that coordinate would be? It'd be at negative 2. Why would it be at negative 2? Because we want to keep that curve going, right? So we need to go down. And then at negative pi, where would that put us at? So at pi, we're at 0. So negative pi, we're also going to be at 0. So that's that side. Okay. All right, now we got to go to 4 pi, right? So from 2 pi, we'll have 5 pi over 2. We'll have 3 pi. We'll have 7 pi over 2. And then we'll have 4 pi. Is everyone okay with that? Now, keeping our curve going, at 5 pi over 2, would I have a maximum of 2 or a minimum of negative 2? Maximum at 2. 3 pi would be an intercept, right? 7 pi over 2 would be a minimum, and then 4 pi would be our intercept. So just keeping our curve. So if you notice, don't you guys see a pattern going with that? So it's up, down for our curve. And there you go. So again, this coefficient gives us our maximum and our minimum value. Okay, so originally it's always 1 and negative 1, but when we multiply by 2, it becomes positive 2 and negative 2. Now, if that was 1/2, our max would be 1/2 and our minimum would be negative 1/2. Okay. All right, so the amplitude, okay, so this 2 where we talk about maximum is actually your amplitude of the 2, okay? So the amplitude of y equals a sine x and y equals a cosine x represents half of the distance between the maximum and minimum values of our function. So our amplitude is always the absolute value of a. Okay, that gives us our max and our min. Okay. In the same coordinate plane, let's sketch the graph of y equals 1/2 of cosine x, and then y equals 3 cosine of x. Okay. So real quick, what is my amplitude of the first one? 1/2. The amplitude of the second one is 3, right? So the amplitude of 1/2 means I have a max of 1/2 and a min of negative 1/2. Max of 3, min of negative 3, right? Okay. Now, when we first looked at this, okay, with our cosine, remember our cosine function, we started not at 0, 0, we always started at 0, 1, right? So that would be our maximum, right? So in this case, we're going to start with our maximum, but our maximum is not 1. Our maximum is what now? 1/2. So we're going to start at 0, 1/2. Okay. Then our intercept, we still go by 90 degrees. So we're going to look at pi over 2. Now at pi over 2 with the sine curve, that was our max or our min, right? Here, that is going to be our intercept. So it'd be pi over 2, 0. So it switches those. Okay. Then our minimum after pi over 2 is pi, right? So our minimum then would be negative 1/2. Our intercept then, what comes after pi? 3 pi over 2, comma, 0. And then again, if I had a max, intercept, min, intercept, then would I have a max or a min next? I'd have a maximum. And my max would be at 0, or sorry, not 0, 4 pi, or 2 pi. I don't know why I got 4. I was going to say 4 pi over 2. But 2 pi, comma, 1/2. Okay. Now, can we graph that? Yeah, so let's go ahead and graph that. So I know I need a max of 3 of this since we're doing the same. So 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And then we have pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Then if I go backwards, that'd be negative pi over 2. Now, does it give us an interval? No. So we would actually kind of keep going with this. Okay. So let's go ahead and graph these now. All right, at 0, 1/2, we have pi over 2, 0, pi negative 1/2, 3 pi over 0, and 2 pi 1/2. Where would negative pi over 2 be? What do you think? If pi over 2 is 0, negative pi over 2 would be at 0 as well. And negative pi would be at negative 1/2. So something like that. Do you see how the amplitude smushed it up with 1/2? Yeah. Okay. Now, cosine of 3 cosine of x. Okay. So now our max value for the new one is not going to be 0, 1/2. It's going to be 0, comma 3, right? Excuse me. My intercept is still going to be pi over 2, comma 0. I had a max and intercept, so now I'm going to have a minimum. And what would my minimum be at? Pi, comma, negative 3. Good. We would have another intercept of 3 pi over 2, comma 0. And then what will I have next? A max, a min, then a max again, right? And what would my max coordinate be? 2 pi, comma 3. Okay. So now let's graph. We have 0, comma 3, pi over 2, 0 again, pi and negative 3, 3 pi over 2, 0. I keep moving my paper, sorry guys. And then 2 pi and 3. So if you look, here's my graph for this side. And where would negative pi over 2 be? 0. And where would negative pi be? Negative 3. Come, be something like this. This would be 5 pi over 2. We hit this way if we went that way, right? If you notice, with the amplitude of 3, it makes it taller, right? Now, if we have a negative in the front of it, what do you think is going to happen? Go ahead, Hunter. Yeah, it's going to flip it, right? It's reflecting over the x-axis. So instead of my max being 0, 1/2, it would actually be a 0, negative 1/2. So this would flip this way and then work its way up, okay? So if this is cosine of 3 or 3 cosine x, which is what we did in the red here, the negative actually just would flip it here. So this would be the negative one. Or that's positive. The negative would be the other one. Okay. All right. Any questions? So if you see a negative in there, it's just going to flip everything. So instead of starting with a maximum, we're going to start with a minimum. For a sine curve, though, a sine curve is still going to start at 0, 0, right? But instead of being pi over 2, comma, the amplitude or the maximum, it will be the negative of it. So it would be a minimum of it. All right. All right, the period, okay? The period of sine and cosine functions is found by taking 2 pi and dividing it by the b. Okay, so the period is found by taking 2 pi divided by the b. The b is the number being multiplied with the x. Okay. So what the period does, instead of being normally 0 to 2 pi, it's going to be 0 to whatever we actually find the period to be, okay? So it's going to actually lengthen out it, okay? So now looking at y equals the sine of x over 2, okay? Since it's not sine the x, we're not looking at a period of 0 to 2 pi, okay? So our period for this is going to be 2 pi divided by b. And what is being multiplied by x here? So if we have x over 2, my b isn't that just 1/2? Yeah. So what is 2 pi divided by 1/2? Isn't that 4 pi? Okay. So now, what that does to this, now in this case, my amplitude is what? What is my amplitude on this one? What's the number in front of sine? Just 1. So we know we're still going to go up 1. My min's going to be -1, okay? Now the amplitude is 4. So to make one whole up and down loop, it was going to go from 0 to 4 pi. So we're not going to be splitting it into pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. We are going to be splitting it into 0. Then we're going to end at 4 pi. But what would split it into 4 equal parts? Would my next one just be pi and then 2 pi? Okay, does that make sense? Because now we're stretching it out. So one loop would actually, if you look at these, we know one loop, one time to do the one function is from 0 to 2 pi. But now we're going, one of these has to go all the way out to 4 pi. So we're splitting it into 4 equal parts in that sense. Okay. So since this is a sine, we know it always goes through 0, 0, right? That's my first one. Okay. And you can't see that. Sorry. 0, 0. Okay. Now, the next one, because we do not have a reflection, we still have a maximum. Instead of going to pi over 2, our period is to 4 pi, so we split it into 4s, so it's just pi. So it'll be pi, and then what's my maximum value? What's my amplitude? My amplitude was 1, so my max is 1. Okay. My next intercept, okay, since we're going by pi here, would be 2 pi, would be 0. Then I've had a max, so now I need to have a minimum value. So we went 0, pi, 2 pi, so now it's 3 pi. And what's my minimum? -1. And then we'll have an intercept again of 4 pi, comma, 0. Okay. So one rotation of my sine curve, okay? So as we look at this, so here's 1, -1. So this would be pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and 4 pi. Okay. So since it's sine, we start at 0, 0, pi 1, 2 pi 0, 3 pi -1, and 4 pi 0. Here would be your sine. So we get one full turn of that sine curve from going from 0 to 4 pi. Okay. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so once you find your period, break it up into 4 equal parts. Okay. One period is usually from 0 to 2 pi. Okay. But if our period changes where we have something occurring to the x, our period gets lengthened or it could get smushed, right? Yeah. All right. Right, and then translations. Remember how you can shift graphs up, down, left, right, all of that? Okay. Now with this one, okay, if we have y equals a sine of bx minus c, okay, or the same thing of y equals a cosine of bx minus c, that c, when it's inside the parenthesis, it shifts it along what axis? When it's inside the parenthesis. It's like our h, right? And what does the h always do? It lies and it moves it left or right. So it's a horizontal shift. Okay. So if you've noticed so far, A is our amplitude, which is our like our max and our min values, right? Or if it's a reflection. The B helps us determine the period. Okay. So one rotation. Okay. And then the C is going to be our horizontal shift. So our left or our right. Okay. Left or right. So we already kind of talked about this. So amplitude again was our A. The period is found by 2 pi over B. Okay. And then how we get it to shift left and right becomes from that bx minus c, right? And now how to actually determine what it is, because we're in the form of radians, right? The first one is you subtract or set it equal to 0. And the second one, what do you think it is? One period is actually always 0 to 2 pi, which is 1/8 or 360, right? Okay. Sorry. All right. So as we look at this, okay, we're just going to analyze this graph here. Okay. So let's talk about it first before we actually do anything. What's this 1/2 known as? Our amplitude. So our amplitude is equal to 1/2. So we know our maximum and our minimum is going to be 1/2, right? So now it's a sine. So because it's sine, we know we normally start at 0, 0, right? Okay, so we would have an intercept, right, to start. Then we would have our maximum. Are you guys okay with that? And an intercept, then a minimum, and then our intercept again. Now, so we know our maximum is going to be what? 1/2. And our minimum is going to be negative 1/2. Okay, are you guys okay with that part? All right. Now, what does this 1/3 or this pi over 3 do? It's going to shift it to the right pi over 3 units, right? Are you guys okay with that? So instead of having my intercept at 0, 0, it's going to shift that intercept to be 0, comma, pi over 3. You guys okay with that? So how do we get that? So the first thing is if we take that bx minus c, which is just x minus pi over 3 equals 0, how do I solve for x? You add the pi over 3, right? So that's where that first intercept comes. So instead of being at 0, 0, we had to shift it right. And why did I put it in the y? I had to shift it right. Pi over 3 units. I don't know why I put it in the y coordinate. Are you guys okay with why it's not in the y coordinate? Shift it right. Okay, is everyone okay with that? Now, our other intercepts are still going to be at comma 0, not 0, comma, okay, because they're intercepts. Now, we need to shift every single coordinate over pi over 3. Can you do that? Yeah. So if I'm at what was my first maximum value before? It was at pi over 2 comma something, right? So can I take pi over 2 and add pi over 3 to that? Yeah, so where would that put me? What is pi over 2 plus pi over 3? Five pi over close 6 over 6. Why? Because you need a common denominator. Is my common denominator 6? So wouldn't that be 3 pi over 6 plus 2 pi over 6 to get us pi over? Okay. Now, our next intercept, if we went 0 to pi over 2, then it was always pi, right? So can you take pi and add pi over 3? Hope so. What is pi over 1 plus pi over 3? 4 pi over 3, yeah. Then my minimum, my next minimum, if we went pi over 2 pi, it was pi over 3 pi over 2, right? So can I move 3 pi over 2 and add pi over 3? Yeah, and what do we get with that? What did you say? 11 pi over 6, yeah. And then the last one was always 2 pi, right? So can we take 2 pi and add pi over 3? And that's where this came from, taking your 2 pi and adding pi over 3. Okay. And what would that give me? Seven pi over 3. There you go. Now, would we be able to graph all those and get our sine curve? Yeah. Okay. So the biggest thing, now we're not starting at 0, 0, we're starting at pi over 3 comma 0. And that would give us our whole period, right? Okay. All right. Now, with all that we just did here, now we're going to actually graph it from that, okay? So let's talk about everything we need to talk about for a second. What does that negative tell me? What does the negative tell me? What? It's flipped, right? So it's a reflection. So do you guys remember how a normal cosine, how does a normal cosine look? Like this, right? For one period. So it's going to flip, so it's going to be kind of like this, right? And then kind of turning for however we go, okay? So we know it's a reflection. What is my amplitude? 3, yep. So now, instead of starting with a minimum or a maximum, we're going to start with a minimum because we know it's flipped because of that negative, right? Okay. What is my period? So instead of going from 0 to 2 pi, do we have a period from this? Yes, remember our period is found by taking 2 pi divided by b, right? What is my b though? What's being multiplied by x? Isn't that 2 pi? So 2 pi divided by 2 pi is 1, right? You guys okay with that? So now we're not going to be breaking it up by pi's and pi over 2's, 2 pi's. We're going to be breaking it up by numbers. Isn't that going to be a little bit easier? Yeah, okay. And then this 4 pi, what does the 4 pi tell me? It's going to shift my graph left 4 pi units, right? Plus 4 pi. So can we find our first coordinate from that? Yeah. Because remember, our first one was always what, 0 comma our amplitude, right? But let's go ahead and do it in this sense. So let's do the formula. 2 pi x plus 4 pi equals 0. Can you guys solve for that? Yes. So in this case, subtract the 4 pi over, right? And then how do I get rid of this 2 pi? Divide. So x is going to equal a negative what? 2. Just 2. Why did the pi's cancel in this? Because pi divided by pi is 1, right? The reason this happens, guys, the pi's cancel because, again, look at your period. Your period is a whole number, right? So my x has to be a whole number because our x-axis isn't getting divided by pi's anymore. They're getting divided by whole numbers, okay? So now, we know normally we have a maximum starting point for cosine, right? This time we're actually going to have a minimum, right? Now, with our minimum, okay, our minimum x coordinate comes from this formula because normally we start at 0 comma something, right? This case, we're going to start at -2. Okay. Now, at -2, what is my minimum value? What was my amplitude? 3. So it's going to be -3. So that means my first coordinate is going to start at 1, 2, 3. Let's go 1/2, -1, -1 and 1/2. So -3/2. I don't know why I put that. -2. Okay. So at -2, I'm going to have a point at -3. Okay. Now, let's do our final point, our other ending point. So we have another minimum value, right? So we'll have minimum, intercept, we'll have a maximum, an intercept, and our minimum, right? So let's go ahead and find our final point from our period. And remember, our period is, our shift is at bx minus c equals 2 pi. Our bx minus 2c isn't that 2 pi x plus 4 pi equals 2 pi? Can we solve that? How do I move that 4 pi over? Subtract this so I get -2 pi. Divide by 2 pi, so x would equal -1. So our following point is going to be -1 comma something. And we know it's going to be a minimum, so it's going to be a negative what? -3, right? So at -1, we're going to be also at -3. So from here to here, from -2 to -1 is my period, right? So our period starts at -2 and goes to -1. That's my period. So we have to split these up into 4s, right? You guys okay with that? So if we split from -1 to -2 into 4s, what are we going to be using for these? Are we going to be using quarters? Yeah. So directly in the middle of -2 and -1, isn't that a -3/2? You guys okay with that? So what would my maximum be in that point? So the direct middle. So here's the starting, the ending, and the middle is our middle point of those two. So what would my maximum be? 3. So at -1/2, we have at 3. So 1, 2, 3. All right. Now we have to find the middle of these two. So what's the middle of -1 and -3/2? What's the middle? Wouldn't that be -1 1/4? And this one would be -1 3/4. You guys okay with that? Or 4, 5, 7/4? -7/4. And -5/4. You guys okay with that? And those are intercepts. So my y coordinate would be 0. So here's what my graph would look like. Would we be able to keep going if I wanted to? Yeah. So if we split these in half, we know what -1/2 is going to be our maximum again, right? Here would be an intercept, there would be an intercept, and then I'd hit 0, 0. So if I kept extending it, it'd be like this, -3. There you go. And vice versa. Okay.
Why would you split it into like -1 pi that's 1/2 and -1 1/2? Because isn't the period what you split before?
Yeah, so our period is 1, and we know we go from -1 to -2. How could I split between -1 and -2 into 4 equal parts? When I split it into quarters? Okay, so if I'm like thinking of a number line, if I'm at -2 and -1, I want to split it into fourths. So when this would be -1 and 1/4, -1 and 1/2, and then -1 and 3/4. When that split that into exact equal 4 parts. Yes.
How did you get the like the -2?
Okay, that's from our shifts, our horizontal shifts, because normally we're at 0, 0, right? Okay, so and then our ending is always at 0, 2 pi, or 2 pi comma 0, right? Okay, so now, so I set what's in the middle here equal to 0, and then I set the other one equal to 2 pi and solved for x. So that would give my x coordinates of my first and my end point of that period. Huh? Where's my work right here? Yes. So that gives us our starting points from all of those. Now, we could have done it like the first one here. I didn't do it that way because we started with 0, 0. So I just shifted. But because I didn't have a b, my period didn't change. That's why I just added or subtracted off that pi, or that pi over 3. Okay, or I guess I added the pi over 3. But if we did the formula, that's where that x minus pi over 3 equals 0. So my first coordinate is going to start at pi over 3. And then if I would have done it to the 2 pi and took x minus pi over 3 equals 2 pi, add the pi over 3 to the other side, and that's where I get 7 pi over 3. So that was my ending value of that. Okay. So because I didn't have a b here, I just went ahead and added the pi over 3 to my original points. But because on this one, we had a b, so my period actually changes. That's why I actually use the formula in the sense to find my starting and finishing value. Okay. All right, so let's look at the next one here. Maybe this one will help. If not, we can do another one later. Okay. All right, sketch the graph of y equals 2 plus 3 cosine 2x. Okay. Now, what do you think this positive 2 at the very beginning is going to do to my graph? It shifts it up 2 units. Okay, that one will shift it up. Okay, that doesn't change any of my x, my period, my amplitude, anything like that. That 2 will just shift every coordinate up 2. So it's going to add 2 to every y coordinate. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the 3 is my amplitude, right? So we know we have a max of 3 and a min of 3. You guys okay with that? All right, this 2 is part of my period, right? So let's go ahead and find our period. So our period is found by taking 2 pi divided by b. And what is my b? 2. So my period is pi. So we're going to start at 0 and go to pi. So how would I split that up into 4 equal parts? I would use 0, and I will end at pi. So how would I split this up into 4 equal parts? Yep, it'd be a fourth, so pi over 4. Then 2 pi over 4, which is just pi over 2. And then 3 pi over 4. Okay. Now, we didn't have to find my starting values, like 0 to pi stayed the same because we didn't shift it left or right anywhere. Okay. Okay, does that make sense? Now, if I would have thrown in a parenthesis around here, like 2x minus 3, then I would have to add or subtract 3 to that because of it. Okay. But that's not there. All right. So now, this is cosine. So we know it kind of looks like this, right? Something like that. Okay, pretty good. All right, so we are going to start at 0. And usually it's our 0 and our maximum, right? But in this case, our maximum is 3, right? So normally we'd have a max of 0, 3, but we have to shift our graph up 2 units, right? So where would that put me? If I'm at 0, 3, and I have to shift it up 2 units, that would put me at 0, comma 5, right? So normally my max would be 3, but we have to shift that max up 2 units. So 3 plus 2 would get me up to 5. Right? Does that make sense to you? Now, at pi over 4, usually it was an intercept, right? And my intercept would be at this pi over 4, comma 0, but we need to shift it up 2 units. So where would that put me? At 2. Yep. Then we would have our minimum, right? And our minimum in this case would be pi over 2, comma, negative 3, but we have to shift it up 2 units. So where would that put me? Negative 1. Okay. Then we would have an intercept again. So that would be at 0, but I have to shift it up 2 units. So now where would that put me? At 2, right? And then we would end up with a max again. And our max is 3. But if I go up 3 units, where does that put me again? At 5. Okay. So now could we graph these? I hope so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2. Which I don't need that. But then we have pi over 4. We have pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and we have pi. Okay. So our first coordinate is at 0, 5. We have pi over 4, 2. We have negative pi over 2, or pi over 2, negative 1. 3 pi over 4, 2. And pi 5. That's what my graph would look. Okay. Now, if we went back to negative 4 pi over 4, where would that put me? If pi over 4 is at 2, what would negative 4 pi over 2 be? Negative 2. And then where would negative pi over 2 be? Negative 1, right? Why? Because pi over 2 is negative 1. Where would negative 3 pi over 4 go? 2. And then negative pi would put me at 5 up here again, right? So wouldn't I be able to continue my graph from there? Like that. And then here would be 1 pi, 1 whole pi over 4, which would be what? 5 pi over 4? Wouldn't that put me back at 2 as well? We can keep going from that in that pattern. Okay, so that's the graphing part. Are you guys okay with the graphing part? That's where we're going to stop today, just practicing your sine and cosine graphs. Okay. All right, you guys at home okay with that? Do you have any questions for me?